hear me okay there? All right. So David will be back next week, and Lord willing, and he'll get back to what he does. But I had one more opportunity to cover some more interesting material. So don't be thinking about that chicken in your crock pot or anything else. You might miss something. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So if you keep up and you keep on listening, you'll find a few little gems in here that you did not know about. And it'll be interesting. And it also rewards you as we go along. There's some interesting things, but it's very near the end, so you'll just have to stay with us here. Had to try really hard. Hope you had some breakfast this morning. Get your brain. Okay. We have a lot of interesting things to cover, and we'll go ahead and pray quickly there. Heavenly Father, we just pray that you would work in a special way today in all the services. Pray that you be with the pastor, give him safety and his family. Pray for those that are going through difficult times. Pray for Brother Lester, that will help him. They'll be able to get to the bottom of it and help him with his health. And pray that you'd be with Susan as well, that she would be able to quickly heal and find relief there. And pray for the others who are hurting and going through hard times, you be close to them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we're not going to do a recap this time, so you can breathe a sigh of relief. But we will touch on a few things that we've mentioned before, so it's going to tie together. And later on, it's even going to tie together to that Sunday morning message that I mentioned about those last 3 kings of Judah. So we're actually going to talk about that too for a moment. Again, this is a very helpful YouTube channel, Expedition Bible. And this guy has been giving tours for years on different YouTube channels. You can actually find him pop up. But now he started this other channel a few months ago, and it's getting a lot of attention from a lot of people. Most of his views have 250,000 to 1 million views because he puts a lot of effort into it, and he's pulling from a whole lifetime of working on this stuff, giving tours, researching it, and he has a book. He'll mention a book if you pay attention there that is on sale on Amazon, which compiles some of this neat stuff too. So he has a lot of great videos, and I'm just picking certain ones which will be interesting. We covered Jericho, we covered Babylon, we covered some other things there as well, interesting stuff. The Temple of Solev in Sudan, where they found that inscription on a pillar about the nomads of Yahweh, and that's from 3,400 years ago. And we're going to cover some other interesting things as well. So Expedition Bible, and this is his video called The Oldest Copy of Scripture Ever Found. This is one of his newer videos, even older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. So not just a mention of Yahweh, but actually Scripture itself. Okay, so we're going to zoom in here, and we're going to zoom in the Middle East. We're going to zoom in further. You see the Dead Sea and all that there, the Red Sea as well. We're going to zoom in further, and where are we going to this time? There's the Jordan River, and there's a little town, and this would be Jerusalem. So here we are, Jerusalem, looking at what it used to look like there. There's a large valley. Notice there's the Kidron Valley to the right, and then to the southwest, there is the other valley, the Hinnom Valley. So we see that valley to the left over there as well. There's that little valley. On the other side of the valley, there's a place called Ketef Hinnom, and they found some interesting things there. But let's talk about that valley quickly. There are some pictures of it modern day. And you can see the pictures. The Hinnom Valley is orange, the Kidron Valley is green, and the town, they would put a lot of things in the valley that they did not want. So like their sewage, like their trash, they would burn stuff there. And so it wasn't really a pleasant place to be around, the Hinnom Valley. Notice the field of blood there. That would be where they think that Judas Iscariot spent that money, bought the field, and then died there. All right, this happens to be in the valley as well. And you can see some valley features today. All right. And you can see some elevation changes. So on the other side of that valley, Ketef Hinnom lies. It's near Jerusalem, the southwest, and it's located there. I think that should be southwest of the old city. It joins the Kidron Valley. And what did they used to do there? We mentioned they had threw their dead animals there for temple sacrifices, to rot and be eaten by worms and maggots. The trash was burned there. The city sewage was emptied there. It smelled really bad. It was very ugly and full of disease. Not a place you want to hang out at, right? And this is also during the Old Testament period where many of the Israelites sacrificed their children to the false gods of Molech and Baal. And it was quite insidious, and there are all over the place in the whole Middle East, there are pottery full of children's bones burned. It's just a mess. And even in one town, they mentioned where there's thousands just in one town. And just a terrible thing that they used to do with those false gods. But in Jesus' time, the Greek translation of Hinnom Valley was Gehenna, which rings a bell, right? Gehenna. It became a synonym for hell. For this reason, the English New Testament versions of the Bible translate Gehenna as hell. It was just a picture for them to relate to about how bad it was going to be. Just a picture. The field of blood, we mentioned Judas Iscariot, 30 pieces of silver. There's a monastery there called Akeldama. All right. Then there's a tomb that just happens to be in the valley, the tomb of a high priest who tried Jesus, Annas. Annas had a son-in-law named Caiaphas, you've heard of as well. But one of the people who was instrumental as a high priest, a religious leader, and his tomb is there. They have a rosette at the top of the tomb. It's the largest one in the whole area. And it even has a picture of the temple, the ancient temple, inside the tomb. But today that is filled with manure. So it's kind of hilarious that their religious leader, who, really did not like Jesus, taking his fame away from him and saying things. You can go there today, so let's look at it. There's this little tomb here in the valley, and he walks the crowd up there giving a tour, and you can look on the outside of it. They have to step around the manure. They walk inside, and there's an inner chamber, you see. There's some inner chambers in there. And then you go to the main room of it again. You look at the walls, and you see that large rosette on the ceiling. And then let's go back to, let's get out of the valley and talk about what's on the other side of the valley. Get to Hinnom. Okay, so what did they find here that's so important? So they found places full of bones. And this fellow, let's see if we talk about him in a second, what his name is, what he did. His name is Gabriel, or they called him Gabby, Dr. Gabby Barkay, B-A-R-K-A-Y. And there's a plaque there because he discovered, along with some others, way back in the 70s, something very interesting. So this is some stuff that was dug up. A lot of places where they would have tombs. Now remember, these tombs back then were for generations of people. So we'll talk about that there. We're going to pan over to the right more, and we'll see a tomb straight ahead, and we're going to see a picture of him, and there's some bones, and this is a picture of what you would find, and then normally a bunch of different pottery, just an example. So we see tomb number 25 on the bottom right, and tomb number 25, they found something very important in 1979. It was, remember, these tomb caves were carved out of rock, and they have a bench inside. You lay the body on the bench for about a year, and it decomposes, and then you take the bones, and you move them off the bench and put them below in a lower chamber called a repository. And you just keep doing this for generations until the repository is full of bones. And you also take the pottery that was in there with the body, and you move it down below as well. And then you go below the bench in this lower chamber in the repository, and you find tons of pottery normally. The problem is grave robbers. So these days, about anywhere you go across the world, grave robbers have already been there, including in Egypt and everywhere else. So they were, even back in the 70s, struggling to find a bunch of precious things that were also in the tomb. So in this one tomb, they found bones from around 95 different people. As you can see, it would last for generations, right? You would move the bones down, you would put another body at the top there, and just keep going. Now in this particular tomb, the whole top part of the cave of the tomb is gone because rock cutters would come in and remove the ceiling. So it looks different than it would have. So there is tomb number 25 in this little diagram. And we can see the bench there and see a little door. That goes down to the repository. But the entire top part that would cover that bench where the body would lay is gone now, because, you know, over the years they want to get more rocks for various projects. There's a door going down to the repository for this tomb, and why is it so important, you ask? So there's a little picture here of what it would be like carved into the rock if the ceiling was still there. And you have a little bench inside and a place for precious treasures and pots and things. Then you have a little door there that he darkened going down, and then you see the little dotted line below that door, the repository. This is standard practice for many, many years. But again, these have been looted greatly, and a lot of them have been destroyed. So we see the bench right there they're looking at. There's the bench to the right, and then there's a little door below. And this was a special one. He shows a picture of how a rock cutter would start taking off the ceiling and keep on taking off the ceiling, and pretty soon it would be completely exposed. There's no roof at all, no walls at all, just the bench. And that's what we see all over the place now, if they're not entirely destroyed. There's a picture of this one. Okay, so if we go to Judah and we see for the same time period, what would it look like if it was totally enclosed? Well, this is what it would look like if it had walls and a ceiling. You see the little repository down below going down there, and the bench. It would look more like that if it was intact still. See the walls, ceiling, doorway. Okay, so all that stuff in red is basically gone from 225. You could lay yourself down on there. I wouldn't recommend it. It's probably pretty nasty. But if you don't fear diseases, so he laid himself down, and then he got some friends to lay down 225. I don't know, it almost looked Photoshopped there, but apparently the shadows are real. So there's a lot of room for more than one body even on the bench. Now, what happened over the years is, because there was no roof, there was a lot of sediment that would get on top of the tomb. So whenever it was discovered, again, years ago in the 70s, they had to dig off this dirt before they even found the tomb. A lot of erosion, a lot of stuff on top. And this is a picture of inside the repository down below, what it looks like today. But this was a special repository. Okay, so there was a group of like junior high kids from an archaeology club that were helping him out. Of course, they were trying, but one of the kids was named Nathan, and he mentions this story because Nathan had a full suite of tools that he would often pull the back shirt of Dr. Barkay to ask him questions. So Dr. Barkay decided to give him something to do. And so he sent him down to the repository just to clean it up so he could be photographed because it looked empty down there. And the kid was down there for about 30 minutes, Nathan. And he felt a tug in his shirt, the doctor did. And he was holding two almost complete pottery vessels, which is not to be expected because it looked bare. So what had happened here? He had found pottery from the first temple period. The first temple period, built by Solomon around 966 BC. So it goes from 970 BC to 597 to 596 BC when the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then there's a second temple period from 516 BC to 70 AD when the temple was rebuilt by Zerubbabel after Cyrus the Great sent them back to the land. Zerubbabel was instrumental in that. And it was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. So the first temple period was older, right? It was older than the second temple period, and that's when the pottery was from. So what had happened, the pottery was down there, but the roof had collapsed, and it was making a false floor. And that's what they were looking at. But then, since the kid liked to play around, he accidentally broke through the floor, and it's a good thing that he did. You'll see why. So there's a bunch of pottery. The pottery at the very bottom, farthest from the door, is the oldest pottery by and large, farthest from that. And you can date the pottery not just on the structure of it, not just on the style, not just on parallel pottery as we talked about extensively in the past, but you can also date it based on how deep it is as well. All right, so inside the repository of this tomb 25, they found over 1,000 objects. The oldest ones were moved to the back of the repository over time to make space for new ones as they moved the decomposed bones and such down there to make room for more. They found 2 small silver plaques. So the whole reason of telling you this is something special they found in there, in this pristine place. 2 small silver plaques which were rolled up 6 or 7 times The plaques were loaded with ancient Hebrew characters which were used only at the first temple area. The Hebrew on these were not the Hebrew characters that you have later on during the second temple era. So it helps to date them, doesn't it? Because they stopped writing Yahweh. You'll see. There were 19 lines of text on these plaques. So basically, later on, they would write Yahweh differently than way back then. He's going down inside there, and he's looking around, talking to the chap. And notice in the far back there's a little illustration of how far they were in the back, where they were found. And they looked like this. And they look like this because they are an exhibit you can go to today. Very tiny. But what makes it special? It's not just Yahweh, it's actually scripture written down from around the 600s, we'll say the 7th century BC. So it's 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Over 400 years older. And it looks like that. And if you look at the translation, the Hebrew characters are just jam-packed on there, rolled up. And that's what the Hebrew characters look like. Pretty fascinating. Because it's very, very old, right? And it's not on animal skins. Just imagine that you just had a thought, well, hey, let's just throw these in there too, in the tomb. Never had a clue how important they would be. And there's around 19 lines of characters. You can zoom in, and that is very important. Those are the characters for Yahweh. But there's more than just that. So that's how they used to write Yahweh, way back in the 7th century BC. And of course, it was YHWH. You know, in Hebrew, they don't have the vowels and such. So this is a picture of Israel today, of course, Jerusalem. All right, so he talks about 2 Kings chapter 21. We're not going to spend too much time on this. Let me look at the time. Yeah. In Jerusalem will I put my name, verse 4, talking about that. And will I put my name forever, verse 7. He's talking about Jerusalem and how God is going to establish it. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 3, I have hallowed this house which thou hast built, to put my name there forever, and mine eyes and mine heart shall be there perpetually. Talking to Solomon after he had finished building his temple in 1 Kings chapter 9. So we're looking at the characters again, and we're going to hear these characters. Yahweh is mentioned multiple times. Now, the silver plaques contain this portion of Scripture from Numbers chapter 6, which you heard before. Numbers chapter 6, verse 24 to 26 was the priestly benediction. And it was written in Numbers by Moses around 1500 BC, a long time ago. And he was recounting, things that had happened when Aaron, Moses' brother, the high priest at the time, would give this benediction. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. So that is what was on them. For starters, I was on the left plaque, and then the other plaque had a prayer about protection from evil, and then some other things were on there too. Silver plaque number 1 contained this phrase, bless you, Yahweh, and keep you. May Yahweh shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. Characters. Number 2 contained, bless you, Yahweh, and keep you. May shine Yahweh his face upon you and give you peace. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yep, it lines up. And then it keeps on going. On number 2, let's see here, let me go back here. Yeah, his face upon you and give you, and that's the peace there at the end. So this is how they would write Yahweh later on, in the Second Temple period. Closer to the time of Jesus, they would write it like this. But this is what they found. This is from the First Temple period. So it helps to date it as even older. This is what they used to write it as back then. Pretty neat. 7th century BC, 400 years older or more than the Dead Sea Scrolls. The earliest preserved writing of biblical verses, and you've never heard of this before, have you? Because nobody talks about these things. It's always Dead Sea Scrolls, Dead Sea Scrolls. But there's a lot more that have been discovered in the past, 80 years, which we haven't even heard of. All right. Then we talk about the Temple of Soleb in Sudan, modern-day Sudan. Used to be ancient Egypt. where they found that pillar that had the inscription of the nomads of Yahweh. But going back to these plaques, these were from the time of the first temple still actually standing, from the time of the prophet Jeremiah, the Davidic dynasty still being there, and the 7th century BC. So this doctor was born in 1944 in the ghetto of Budapest, Hungary. He then immigrated to Israel in the 1950s. He earned his PhD in archaeology from the Tel Aviv University, and he's now an external lecturer. But when he was a child, each Friday, his father would put his hands upon his son's head and say this priestly benediction. It was the first Hebrew words which he remembers, Dr. Barkay. It is known as the priestly blessing scrolls. The priestly blessing scrolls were the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, and you can research it today. And he was able to be a part of that. We could go into more detail about the cave's dimensions and the lack of light when they were digging in there. And there were 3 junior high students that were digging in there, but then when they realized what they had, as they kept on searching, they replaced them with adults. One of the people was an archaeology student from Wheaton College at the time called Judy Hadley. Judy found that first silver plaque. So Nathan was the one who broke through the floor, but then Judy found the first plaque. The next day, the second plaque was found when they were sifting through it. And as we know, this was written way back around the 15th century BC by Moses, originally. And then the verses were in the Bible, and then the verses from the Bible were put onto these little silver plaques. Interesting stuff. And the amulet was found very close to the floor itself, buried deeply. They looked at their notes when people started to question it, and they realized it was in the far back quadrant. It was very deep. It was very, very old indeed. So here's the Temple of Sola that we talked about. You can drive there today, you can look at the pillars. You can see on the pillar there's a character, land, nomads, Yahweh. Right at the time when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, they were mentioned by Amenhotep III, who was the 9th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. 3,400 years ago, in the 15th century BC, they created these pillars, and it lines up perfectly with the Bible when they were wandering around. And that's just another example of Yahweh being found in hieroglyphics, for example. Okay, moving on. Evidence that King David's descendants survived in exile. So this ties into all that stuff last time we talked about with Babylon. And that's online if you want to see it on our Facebook page. But in 1899, Robert Coldaway, you might remember that name from last time, he excavated ancient Babylon. He worked there from 1899 to 1917 and ended because of World War I. He dug up the most dirt of any site anywhere, basically, because he got 200 workers to work daily for 15 years just moving dirt. They moved so much dirt to excavate the entire place of the town of Babylon. It was quite the adventure. And then there's a picture of him there. It's pretty neat they thought to take pictures back then of these people. There is a portion of the wall of Babylon, because he excavated it really well with his team of laborers. And there's pictures of those guys. And there's a picture of him, Coldaway. So we're back to Babylon now. This looks familiar. The processional way, the Ishtar Gate, straight ahead, and the temple on the right. But there's a red line about the processional way. He was focused on that to begin with, digging down. And way back there, the temple of Moloch and Marduk, that was Marduk. And then on the hill, there was some other things like a ziggurat and other temples to other gods. Check this out. So this is a picture from back then. He has trains and such, little carts to carry the dirt. Notice sticking up right in the middle of the picture is a part of the Ishtar Gate, right there. Pretty fascinating. You can even see the characters on it. Let's zoom in. And it's just sticking up right there. It's just being dug down. And boy, did they have to dig down. They had to dig down 80 feet just to get to the pavers of the ground, the floor. 80 feet to get to the processional way. Just an immense amount of dirt moved. Okay, and then, as you walk through the processional way, you'll see like the lower 40 feet of walls and such, but then the upper 40 feet are basically destroyed. He found 37,000 fragments from those upper parts of the area that were shipped in crates back to Berlin and then reconstructed for the Berlin Museum. So this is an overhead picture of the processional way, the Ishtar Gate area today. This is, if you walk through, notice on the left you can see some of the interesting stones like that on the left there. And they're all over the place. You can see them all over as you walk through. Just the lower parts. These are examples of fragments you found. Okay. And these are examples of, imagine, crossword puzzles, you guys. This is not a crossword puzzle. It's not a jigsaw puzzle. It's a much worse jigsaw puzzle. Imagine you had 37,000 pieces of rock and you were trying to put them together to make, that's just incredible. And you put them in crates, ship them back to Berlin, and look at these wonderful tables full of rocks. And you have to make sense out of it for the rest of your life, basically. Just imagine how long that would take. All these people, just tons and tons of rocks. So this is a picture of the Ishtar Gate, back then, what it used to look like, and this illustration of just how majestic it was. And so he went to Berlin to look at it today. So you can go there and you can see the reconstructed walls of the processional way. You can see there are 60 lines on each side, 120 lines on the walls during this processional way. Pretty wild. You can see on the bottom middle, that part of the ancient area. The dragon was ridden on by their god Marduk and also his son Nebu, like Nebuchadnezzar, named after Nebu, didn't mention that last time. The bull was a symbol for him, who was also known as the inventor, Nebu, of cuneiform and other things. Picture of the processional way leading up to the Ishtar Gate. And you can go there in the Bluestone Museum and see that today. And that's the reconstruction. They had all those pieces, didn't they? Pretty fascinating. And that's probably just the top part of the gate. Remember, it's like 80 feet tall. So there's a picture of a dragon. There we go, because that was very important for there. And there's a picture of a bull for Nebu. Near the complex, near the gate, there is a special area with 14 rooms with arched ceilings made of stone. And when he was excavating it, he thought this might be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which some people now believe were in Nineveh, over 200 miles north. But he did excavate this area extensively. And why are we talking about this again? Because we're getting to the point, believe it or not. Okay, so you see this area, that big old building area, with a little red arrow. And you see a little diagram of the arched ceilings and all these different interesting little places inside. You can walk through there today. What did they find in this area? In 1903, he excavated a staircase from this building, which went down all the way to the entrance of the building. Near the staircase, he found a cache of over 300 ancient cuneiform tablets. The tablets were ancient receipts from the palace administration. It lists them giving out rations to prisoners, like oil and grain. They became known as the ration tablets. And if you walk to that staircase, they've resurfaced the top of the staircase, but you can walk right where they found the tablets. That's the whole reason he came here. And that's where they found this gigantic cache of them buried. And there's the picture of the particular tablet we're concerned about. But why? Why is it such a big deal? Let's zoom in further. Quite a bit of work on these little tablets, right? This one says, 10 selah of oil to Joachim, king of Judah. 2.5 selah of oil to the sons of the king of Judah. What does this tell you? They were prisoners, and the king and his sons were prisoners. Now, Joachim was a name for Jehoiakim, not Jehoiakim, his father, not Hezekiah, his uncle who preceded him, but Jehoiakim. So, the line of David was preserved during the Babylonian captivity, and we have a record of it being preserved as well. And let's move on. So they highlighted that name. There it is, and in case you can go there today at the Berlin Museum and see that particular fragment. This is how they labeled it, which means ration list mentioning Jehoiakim of Judah, Babylonian captivity 580 BC. The Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7 talks about how God was going to establish David's kingdom and take care of his line. It would be preserved, the line of the tribe of Judah. In contrast, we see the house of Baasha would be wiped out by God. And it's actually with two A's, B-A-A-S-H-A. 1 Kings chapter 16 talks all about how God spoke to Jehu, and Jehu gave a prophecy against Baasha, that basically his whole line was going to be wiped out by God. He was an incredibly evil person, he was a leader, and that is exactly what happened. He is going to make his house like the house of Jeroboam. And verse 7 of 1 Kings 16, for all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, and provoking him to anger with the works of his hands, and him being like the house of Jeroboam. Let's move on. What happens next? Elah, the son of Baasha, reigned over Israel 2 years. So he's off the scene, now his son's on the scene, and his servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him. Zimri smote him and killed him in verse 10. Then he slew all of his sons, all of his kinsfolk, and his friends, that were male especially. Destroyed his entire house, because he had provoked the Lord. So let's now look at the last 3 kings of Judah before captivity. We mentioned this in the sermon. Jehoiakim, his son, and his uncle, who was named Mattaniah, but Nebuchadnezzar renamed Mattaniah Hezekiah. So Nebuchadnezzar was basically, in charge, and they were kind of like puppet kings in a way. And some of them rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. If we go to 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25, it talks all about these 3 people. 2 Kings 24 and 25. And how the downfall of Jehoiakim, who was an evil king, verse 6, he slept with his fathers, and his son Jehoiakim reigned in his stead. And then we proceed on. Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 3 months, which is kind of funny, isn't it? 3 months. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, not a surprise, according to all that his father had done. And then verse 10, and it talks about how Nebuchadnezzar came in verse 11 to the city. His servants besieged it. Verse 12, and Jehoiakim, remember that tablet talking about Jehoiakim? Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon. He and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers, and the king of Babylon took him. They took him, didn't kill him, in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried out thence all the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold which Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of the Lord, as the Lord had said. Of course, they hauled off those nice things. They carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives. And all the craftsmen and smiths, none remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land. He left people to be vine dressers and such, and husbandmen over the crops. Verse 15, and he carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, and the king's mother, and the king's wives, and his officers, and the mighty men of the land. Those carried he into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And that is what we found, isn't it? Pretty wild. And all the men of might, even 7,000, and craftsmen and smiths 1,000, and all that were strong and apt for war, even them the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah his father's brother, that would be his uncle, right? Made him king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. Verse 19, and he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done, his grandpa. Well, actually, that is, not his grandpa. Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. Not a good idea. Not only did he rebel against God, but he also rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. So that kind of spelled his fate, didn't it? And chapter 25 talks about his downfall and how terrible that was, and how he was definitely killed and was not hauled off to. And he had it. We can go into detail, but it's pretty rough how he died and his line died. So how was the Davidic line going to continue through Jehoiakim? He was miraculously spared. Pretty fascinating stuff. Okay. So he talks about how it's sort of like when in sports the cameraman gets faked out because he doesn't know where the ball went, and the other team doesn't know where the ball went, the defense. But in this case, you think you know what's going to happen in the kingly line of David, but we have a surprise with Jehoiakim being the one that was spared in his line. But then it gets more interesting about what happens to Jehoiakim's line. So he gives that little example. Jehoiakim, the last part of 2 Kings, gives us a little bit of hope, because the last part of 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 to 30, and it came to pass in the 7th and 30th year of the captivity of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, that evil Merodach. Now, it's funny when your ruler's name starts with evil, right? That evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign. So he just started his reign, did lift up the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, out of prison. And he spake kindly to him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. Just imagine just a whole bunch of captive kings in prison. They weren't even killed. He's just one of many kings that were just sitting there in captivity. But he lifted him above all the others and changed his prison garments, and he did eat bread continually before him all the days of his life. And his allowance was a continual allowance given him of the king, a daily rate for every day, all the days of his life. It even talks about like the ration that he got. That's pretty fascinating. Almost as if, God knew that we were going to find something that would line up with this. Pretty wild. Now there were rulers of the land, but he set his throne above all those rulers in Babylon as well. Sort of like Joseph. Pretty neat. Okay, there's a little piece again. There's a little view of just how vast this town was. Ishtar Gate as well. Overhead view again. And we're just going to go on. We talked about what that said on there and how it mentioned Jehoiakim. Now, here's how it ties in further. He and his sons were taken into captivity. Jehoiakim was also known as Jeconiah. And he had sons like Shealtiel and Pedaiah. Now, Jehoiakim had a grandson named Zerubbabel. Does that ring a bell? Zerubbabel was the one that rebuilt the temple. Pretty wild, the second temple period. So his grandchild just happened to be Zerubbabel. So it was pretty important that he was spared. Now, the Bible mentions that Zerubbabel's father was Shealtiel and Pedaiah, two brothers. So it could be that maybe Shealtiel's wife, maybe he had died, and his wife then became the wife of Pedaiah, as was the case in the time. You take your brother's wife, right? And the child was known to be the son of Shealtiel to preserve his line. So that could be how the Bible lines up with mentioning both of their names, the two sons of Jehoiakim. Now, Cyrus the Great, as you know, allowed the Israelites to go back to their land, and Zerubbabel will be the one that will be known as a rebuilder of the temple. He found an opportune time to do it because there was a rebellion going on in the land of the Babylonians. I think it was Darius the First. So he was able to kind of operate while they were distracted. Pretty neat. And then we talk about how in Luke chapter 1, it talks about how Jesus was going to be, on the throne of his father David. And the genealogy in the New Testament, one of the genealogies is technically of Mary, and one is of Joseph, and they're both going back to the house of David. Pretty wild. So you can go there and walk through, and you can see where the tablets were. And you can go through the Berlin Museum, you can check out all that stuff, you can see the guy that spent a lot of years there with a lot of people digging that stuff up. And how far they had to dig down. And then this guy has a book called Where God Came Down. Where God Came Down. His last name is Kramer, Kramer. It's on Amazon, and he has a lot of pictures. And it mentions some of these things that he mentions in his videos, and it's selling quite well. We're going to get to King David's tomb some other time because we need to go ahead and wrap it up. But there's much more that we can cover. And we appreciate your good attention. And later on, with King David's tomb, we actually get back and we talk about Kathleen Mary Kenyon, the same person from Jericho that discredited that, being from the layer that had the earthquake and the burning in that layer. She also had a place in the tomb of King David where she came along after some others and confused people as well. So that's kind of funny. All right, y'all have a great day. Thank you.